Uncertainty in resource estimates has been a bit of a passion of mine for quite a few years now, mainly stemming from my time with my first period of time with CIA, as it was in those days, working on the exploration and feasibility studies of Century in northwest Queensland, and then subsequently on Bugle River, where I was fortunate enough to have Harry Parker sharing an office with me for about 12 months, and Andre Janelle for a good half of that, and some pretty skilled people in Rio Tinto there as well, Peter Ravenscroft and Andy Thwaites, who are both out doing their own thing elsewhere in the industry now. But it really brought home the significance of importance of just how important it is to understand. First and foremost, you can do anything you like geostatistically, but if you don't understand the data, you don't understand the geology that data is based on, then you're starting from a base where you're going to face some problems as the project develops. First question is, why should we care about uncertainty? We know it exists, but why is it significant? We're going through a period at the moment with the update of the JORC code and commentary on the application of the JORC code and the quality of public reports by mining companies from regulators, including ASIC and the ASX, that the mining industry is developing a reputation for value destruction, which may be true, may not be true. I think there's all sorts of arguments against that, but there's no doubt that unrecognised and unmanaged resource risk is a cause of mineral resource development in mining projects, if not failures, and at least underperformance. Some work by the CIM in Canada over in 1998 said that 40% of projects in Canada had problems with grade estimates, so were underperforming with their run-of-mine grades, weren't achieving what feasibility studies said that they should achieve. And 24% of those projects underestimated or overestimated their resources. And that's important because ultimately mineral resource estimates are the basis of an ore reserve estimate, which goes on to be the basis of a mine's production schedule and the financial plan on which that business is based. And so if you're starting from a poor basis and all of those downstream estimates and data that the business is based on don't stack up. And really, we're facing an environment at the moment where stakeholders are demanding more and more transparent disclosure of risk when considering investments. And it just makes sense. If you don't know what your risks are, if you can't elaborate on what those risks are or understand where the risks are, then you can't manage them. So identifying where they are and even trying to quantify what the risks are is very important. And it's a feature of every resource estimate. We're dealing with uncertainty because we're taking point samples and extrapolating them through space to come up with a prediction of what's present in a volume of mineralisation that makes up a deposit. So really, geologists have a key role in being risk managers. We need to be able to recognise and clearly document what the sources of uncertainty in any project are and develop strategies to mitigate and manage that uncertainty and communicate effectively to engineers and financial people and project management just what the potential impacts of that uncertainty is. And then make sure that we do that in a language that other professionals can understand, which is frankly a real problem in geoscience. We have fields in geoscience that can't even communicate with each other because of the selected, the different terminology that gets used. There's a need to step back and use some plain English. I think that the message is out there anyway, and there's a really good course that the AIG offers benefit of membership at the moment on geoscience communication, which throw the ad in at the moment. It's all worth having a look at. The login details are on the membership portal on the website. Requirements for reporting uncertainty and discussing uncertainty are not new. Mineral resource classification in the JORC code is there to communicate the level of uncertainty affecting different parts of the deposit. So we'll have parts of the deposit that we think are fairly well understood, that get called measured, and parts of the deposit that are not so well understood, that get classified as indicated, and parts that are even less well understood that get called inferred, or they might get called inventory and not reported publicly. Classification, though, very often gets treated and communicated as a technical issue. We talk in terms of the number of drill holes and the spacing of those drill holes and the numbers of sectors around the drill holes in which other drill holes appeared, and that might be understandable by another geoscientist who's able to act as a competent person or a qualified person in Canada for those sorts of mineral resource estimates, but really doesn't ring with anybody outside the profession. Classification criteria also are very subjective. They're purely at the discretion of the competent person. So they can be subjective and they can vary enormously for deposits of the same commodity in the same mineralisation style. And communicating that to a largely non-technical audience who are relying on the information that's in mineral resource reports can be a really difficult task. There's quite a good article by Ringrose and Bentley recently that described the purpose of the geological model as being representations. They use the word cellular proxies, which capture the essence of the underlying complexity, extracting only the detail which is necessary to address commercial questions. So there's a role for geologists to look at the deposit and start to think about how it might be developed or what the information that's needed is needed to progress the development of that deposit without making too many decisions about mining methods and cut-off grades and that sort of thing. But making sure the essentials are covered and making sure the information's there for engineers and metallurgists and environmental scientists and even people involved in communicating what's being done on the ground to other stakeholders in the area. Being able to really answer all of the variety of questions which is going to come from all of those disparate fields. But not trying to build a super accurate, detailed interpretation of the deposit geology. We're not going to build outlines of mineralised domains in a deposit which follow a particular cleavage or orientation or something like that. We've got to look at the critical aspects of the fabric of the deposit. So really what they're saying is we need to be thinking about developing geological models and making decisions on what is and what isn't commercially significant, which requires a bit of judgment on geoscientists' part. But also there's a need, firstly, to understand the size of the prize, but also to understand resource continuity. And it's a continuity question which often gets overlooked. because they're both key factors that are going to impact resource evaluation, and they're going to impact every stage of project development. So like if we're going out, we drill a hole, we get an ore grade width intersection in that hole, we get quite excited as the prospect of a discovery. Where's the next hole going to be drilled? You're going to drill right beside the hole where you've got the good intersection first, aren't you? No. The management pressure will be to step out and show that this thing's bigger than an Olympic dam and it's going to make us billions of dollars, which throws us into a completely different state of mind and project execution. Resource estimates themselves are pretty interesting. They represent a decision point in the mining value chain. It shouldn't say mode, it should say node. Spell check if failing. At least 40% of publicly reported resource estimates are based on inverse distance, grade, and bulk density estimation techniques. So Harry Parker would have used the description of saying that they're based on an accident of data configuration, which is pretty right. That's what inverse distance is. You're joining dots with an arbitrary weighting factor to determine what's in between those points. More than half of the domains that we use in building geological model are based on explicit interpretations rather than implicit models, which consider the characteristics of data. And even, I'd argue that even most implicit models are just proxies for explicit models. So you're only looking at one potential interpretation. And the majority of resource estimates are considered to be deliberately conservative. Why? Because there's a perception that it's better to undershoot reality than overestimate what might be there. Century was a case in point where we took a conservative approach to the mineral resource estimate. This is years ago, and produced a model of the deposit which wasn't economic. And by going back and taking a much harder view of the data and actually using estimation parameters that we thought were favourable for the project or realistic for the project, we turned the NPV of the project around from a negative NPV to about a moderately positive NPV. By the time we finished with the optimisation process, the NPV was 10 times that. And that was realised when the mine was actually developed and then it's ran through its whole life. Continuity is a really interesting question. As a young geologist, which is a long time ago now, but I still remember it, so that's how much it's stuck. Someone told me that geostatistics are useless. By the time you've collected enough data to use it, you've mined the deposit. And in many of the projects that we're pursuing, that's probably not too far from the truth. Because in exploration, we spend an inordinate amount of time out here in uncorrelated space. We're drilling holes to inform us about the deposit, which are too far apart from the existing holes to have any bearing on predicting what might be between them. Which is one of the problems, one of the fundamental problems of the way a lot of resource estimation gets, a lot of resource definition and estimation gets done. The critical part of the variogram's in here. We want to know the shape of the variogram, we want to know what this nugget effect is and what the range is, because beyond that point, we don't know what the relationship between drill holes is. But within that point, we can start to make meaningful predictions based on the data about what might be present in between sampling points. So close space drilling at an early stage of a project, while it's not going to help with a stock exchange announcement, tells us a lot about what might actually be needed eventually in terms of the amount of drilling really to understand this deposit. And particularly if we're dealing with a big deposit, then the focus then should really be on upgrading the confidence of the resource in part of the deposit that's likely to be mined first, and can justify and repay the capital that's invested in the project, so that the additional resource evaluation drilling that's going to be needed can be funded from revenue. It's not capital that's weighing the project down up front. This diagram should probably extend out a bit further to the left, but if we look at the value of a project, there's always a kick after the first significant. It starts from zero. There's always a kick after the first good intersection when speculators recognise that, oh, there's some legs in this. We should get into it. Price goes up. Doesn't stay up for very long. Falls back to a slightly lower level. Some of those early speculators get out. Others stay with the project. We progress along to a discovery, which is really the point at which we've got enough drilling to say, yes, we're confident that there's something here that's potentially economic. It's not the first drill hole that has an ore-grade intersection. You've got to have a series of holes that are stacking up and saying there really is something here that represents a volume of mineralisation. And then the value of the project starts to climb. And we get this point in here between the initial desktop studies and the pre-feasibility study, where a maiden resource estimate usually gets reported to the exchange, which further drives an upward trend in the value of the project. We get to the feasibility study, where most of the learning should have been done by that stage. The purpose of a pre-feasibility study really is to identify what the options are and what the merits of those different options are, not to lock down on a particular preferred development option for the project. The pre-feasibility study should provide one or two of those options for the feasibility study. And the feasibility study is where the best way of developing that project gets fleshed out and looked at in detail. Then the value curve flattens off. But after that, it's really successful commissioning and renewal of reserves through further resource evaluation drilling that sees the project progress and continue to be a generator of value. This is also, you know, between the desktop study and the feasibility study, we're also dealing with a period in the project's development where the complexity of the problems that are being dealt with by the whole project team just escalate constantly. So up until the desktop study or discovery and through the desktop study, geologists are dealing with a fairly limited range of questions. They're focusing on grade and tons. But as soon as we get towards the pre-feasibility study, then all of a sudden there's a group of people starting to look at baseline data collection for environmental studies, and they want to know about waste rock characterization. So how much work have we done before then to understand what the characteristics of the different waste rocks are? We don't analyse them, they haven't got the mineralisation in them. They're not going to be economic, but they are going to be economic. You've got something in there that's got deleterious waste generation properties, and there's a management cost associated with it. You've got to be prepared to answer those questions. Engineers start to get involved at the pre-feasibility, at the desktop pre-feasibility study stage. Metallurgists start asking all of these questions about mineralogy that we haven't thought about up to that point because we focused on grade. And that's probably changed a bit in the last few years with the advent of, you know, low-cost hyperspectral techniques for mineralogical data collection. that there's probably actually quite a bit of improvement due to that, but it's generating more and more data of different types that we haven't had to think about before, and need to start thinking about how that's going to be presented to the other teams of the project. Which is where, again, this question about what's going to be asked and how we have the data to answer those questions is an important one. That's all things that are part of the initial consideration of how do we manage risks that are associated with the project, is how do we answer questions. There's an issue with geological interpretations and even just geological observations. No significant project is the work of a single person. There's always a team of people on site, and every member of that team will have a different way of describing what they're seeing based on their previous experience. So some sort of structure to achieving consistency is absolutely critical. There's all sorts of potential for variation in interpretation between points of observation, mapped in outcrops or observed in drilling. And we need to be trying to think of ways to minimising the degrees of freedom about which that variation can rely on. The same applies to grade. We need to have enough data to robustly estimate what's between those points of observation, sample points. Adequacy of data itself is important. How do we know that we're collecting enough reliable data to answer the questions that we're going to be asked? And that being able to resolve that takes quite a bit of thought and planning and time making sure that information gets pulled together. And really, it comes down to when do we begin to start to think this project's going to be successful? And the answer to that is, in my view, is we've got to do that at a very early stage, even though it may not be correct. But if we don't do it at that early stage of project development, then the likelihood of it being successful is actually being eroded by that omission, by that not doing that critical work. So we need to start to think about, what might be the modifying factors of technical research, and what aspects of those modifying factors are going to be geological, what can we actually pin down and make that decision a much more informed one. So there's always alternative interpretations. There's no two deposits anywhere in the world like that. They're all the product of complex geological processes. If the geological processes at the sites where they occur weren't complex, they wouldn't be there. So we can't just use one deposit as a model for another. When I worked for Paslinko, we had 2 Mississippi Valley type lead zinc operations in Western Tennessee. And we often talked to the geologists on the mines about resource classification. They just said, Western Tennessee, everything with 11 feet stays drilling, because that's the way we do it in Western Tennessee. It had nothing to do with the characteristics of the deposit, but that's how it was done in Western Tennessee. Every deposit's unique in detail. Data's never unambiguous, but there's steps that we can take to make data less ambiguous. So there's always a potential for alternative interpretations. So, there's actually techniques that can be used to start to look at what the impact of those alternative interpretations may be, and how that impacts the project downstream. And we need to be a lot more cognizant of that. Stochastic techniques have been used by the oil and gas industry in the late 70s to model inherent uncertainty in reservoirs. Now, a petroleum reservoir is going to be infinitely more continuous than most mineral deposits, but they're also dealing with much sparser geological information than as mineral exploration geoscientists we're ever going to be asked to deal with. So they might have one or two drill holes and seismic data between the drill holes, and they're basing their entire understanding of the reservoir characteristics on those one or two holes and interpreting what's happened between and what they can see in the seismic. But the techniques that they're using are readily transferable to mineral sector applications. There was a burst of interest probably about 15, 20 years ago now, where a couple of banks started saying to customers, we're not going to finance your projects unless you've got a simulated estimate of what this deposit might be like, and we can actually see what the inherent variability in those resource estimates might be. And that lasted a couple of years before practitioners said it's too hard, there's too much data, we don't have the computing capacity to manage it, it takes too long, it's not feasible. And that situation's changed. You know, we need to support that sort of understanding, we need to start rethinking our whole process of geological data collection so that we're actually collecting the information that can feed into those sorts of studies. We need to be, again, I'll just re-emphasise, we need to be looking at both potential and size, because that's important. You know, that's ultimately going to determine the rate at which you mine the deposit and the life of the operation. But we also need to look at variability, because that's going to have as much impact on production rates as anything else. If you've got a highly variable ore body that you have to mine very selectively, it doesn't matter if it's in an open cut or underground, you're not going to mine that at the same rate as a deposit that's amenable to bulk mining. And that has a whole flow-on effect through mining options and the economics of the project. And again, they're questions that we need not to answer, but provide the data that's going to be used by the members of the project team that are working specifically on those issues to develop the understanding they need to have and be confident about what they're saying. So it comes down to looking at all sorts of aspects of the data, like sampling protocols. Are we sampling the deposit correctly? And by that I mean, you know, it could be as simple as making a decision about we drill this with RC or we drill this with diamond drill. And really the answer to that, RC is attractive, it's fast, it's low cost, you get an assay value out of it, but the assay value you get may not be the real assay of the mineralisation, because you're sampling, if you've got mineralisation that has, that you can, if you look at a piece of drill core and you can see what's controlling that mineralisation distribution, where mineralisation starts and where it stops and why it stops and why it starts again. If you can see that in a piece of core, you can actually sample to those boundaries and know what the actual grade of the mineralised material is. You can't do that in RC. You're potentially diluting every sample, or a good proportion of the samples that we're looking at. We need to look at the suites of elements that are being analysed for. Okay, we've got a copper gold project. We're not just going to go out and analyse the copper and gold. You need to know whether there's any other potentially economic constituents present. We need to know what the character of the gangue mineralisation is, because that can inform the chemists that are analysing the samples about just what they have to do to deal with samples with different gangue constituents. The project I'm working on now is a copper gold project, but there's barite in the gangue. And there's lead and zinc mineralisation as well. But if you run that through a conventional 3 or 4 acid digest, the fact that there's barium present in the gangue suppresses the base metal values in solution. It complexes with the lead, zinc and copper, takes them out of solution, they don't report to the assay industry. The chemists have to know more about the material to overcome those effects. And if we're not giving them that information, then the whole project is disadvantaged. A broader analytical suite tells us lots about potential characteristics of interburden and overburden materials as well. It could have all sorts of management implications when they finally make it to a waste dump or tailings tank. And that's the first question that environmental scientists and metallurgists can ask. Is, you know, what's going to be present in the residues that come out of the plant, not the concentrates that come out of the plant. And what contribution could mineralogical data make? Copper, again, is another great example where, you know, there might be 4 or 5 different potentially economic copper minerals present in a deposit, but they all have a different processing. And unless we can tell the metallurgists what the proportions of those different minerals are, then it's likely that the processing route designed for the project, the flow sheet designed for the project, is going to be less than optimal. And that has a negative effect on project value. So there's all sorts of alternatives, there's all sorts of uncertainties that we can engineer out just by better data collection. Oops, sorry. So again, Bentley and Ringrose described 3 approaches to mineral resource uncertainty quantification. And the first approach is to make a best guess. Argue what a base case of the project might be and why that's a base case and what's the uncertainty you expect to be associated with that base case, which is pretty rough, but it's better than nothing. And nothing is the status quo of what we're doing. The next step is to run multiple deterministic scenarios. So don't just build one model, build a few. If you think that there might be uncertainty about the density of faulting affecting a deposit, or factors that cause grades to vary in an unpredictable way, or we're going to treat the boundary between this domain and that domain as a soft boundary, so we'll look at data each side of the boundary to inform what's in that domain, or we'll have a hard boundary between the domain, or we don't do that. Running those 2 or 3 different scenarios can make quite a difference to the resource that gets reported in terms of grade and tonnes. And we're using the same data, so it's all feeding into our understanding of deposit. And finally, stochastic techniques is where we can actually statistically develop multiple equally probable realizations of what the deposit might look like. And the interesting thing with stochastic interpretations is they give you an idea of variance. So in a block model, for every cell in the block model, so we've got copper values again. You haven't got one copper value, you've got a histogram of 100 copper values. And you can describe the nature and width of that histogram. So you're starting to put confidence limits around grade if you're estimating in that block. And also they describe entropy. So how rapidly or how spotty the grade distribution of each realisation looks gives you an idea as to, gives you infinite hard information about how variable that resource estimate might be. So it's saying that the data that you've got is, you'll look and you'll see different amounts of entropy in different parts of the deposit. And that data is telling you that we've got this area pretty well pinned down with the drilling we have, but this area needs more work. So not only are you developing an understanding of the drilling, of what drilling is telling you, it's telling you specifically where you need to collect more data. Rather than just going back and drilling a deposit on a grid, we can actually drill to target uncertainty and probably reduce the amount of drilling you have to do to bring that resource estimate up to the desired level of confidence. Oops. So things about, core versus RC drilling. I think if you've got a deposit where you can, in core, where you can see what's controlling mineralisation distribution, then the decision to no-brainer. RC drilling is not going to give you a reliable indication of the grade of that deposit. If that control on mineralisation is a bit less visible and less certain, then we're not going to be able to control, use production control techniques which introduce that level of selectivity. So, RC might be okay, provided you're taking steps to monitor recovery and the assay data that's coming back, good recovery, good representation. Assay data that's coming back from the samples is okay. Sometimes in sampling core, we introduce mining assumptions that may not be appropriate, and that limits engineers' ability to plan for different levels of ore loss and dilution, for example. Because they're two different parameters that both have quite different impacts on the economic project. Some projects are more susceptible to ore loss than they are to dilution. Other projects, it's the other way around. But if we can't specifically say how much, they can't specifically work out what the level of ore loss is likely to be and what the level of dilution is likely to be, they can't make those sorts of decisions. We also don't get a lot of information about other things from RC drilling, like mineralisation, and I think we sacrifice some knowledge of mineralisation, texture and paragenesis, which you can see in core. We don't get anything in the way of basic geotechnical it's dramatic. And you lose sample return, or you get lots of water inflows or something like that at a particular point down the holes. And that's going to have implications for how the project is evaluated down the track. And what additional data we need to collect down the track. Oriented core, I think, is one of the really key tools that we've got for reducing uncertainty in geological modelling, because it tells you in this drill hole that boundary is oriented like this. And so you make sure that the model of the drill hole that you produce, the boundary of that surface is oriented like that. And most of the geologic software that's out there now lets you do that. You can not only tell the software the elevation of that point in the drill hole, but you can tell it the attitude of that surface in the drill hole, and it'll honour it. And that will change the way that the software interprets how that surface extends to the next drill hole. So you start to see things like faults and other structures that are discontinuous, other discontinuities that are affecting ore body continuity. Bulk densities, always a thorny issue in resource estimation. It's, how do you measure it, really? Most laboratory techniques are actually measuring specific gravity and then making an adjustment to porosity and moisture content and coming up with an estimated bulk density figure. But you can actually measure it geophysically. The oil and gas industry has been doing that now for 50 or 60 years. And the gear is actually available in slimline form, and you can run it down mineral exploration drill holes. There's even density sources now that are so low activity that they don't have to be licensed. And if you do have a mishap and you can't recover the source, it's not going to sterilise any of your ore body. So the technology's there and it's available. Spectral gamma can tell us a lot about lithology and mineralogy. Fluid saturation, again, can be measured. It's a nuclear tool for measuring hydrogen density, basically. But there are low activity tools that can do that. And structural data is a really big one from my point of view. Dip meter tools are like a 3-arm or a 4-arm resistivity probe. So there's a gyro in the tool that tells you exactly in space where those three arms are, and you get three resistivity logs of the hole, and you can correlate peaks and troughs on those resistivity logs to work out what the attitude of the surface is, and then feed that into the modeling software and make it honour that geology. There's a 12-arm tool now that Schlumberger market in slimline form that is actually like telling you. It gives you, or telling you is another way of doing it too, but it actually gives you an image of what the attitude of the bedding or foliations or discontinuity joints and other discontinuities affecting that, intersecting that whole arm. And you can start to put real three-dimensional information into models. In recent years, we've seen seismic data becoming more and more widely used in mineral exploration because the processing algorithms and the instrumentation has been upgraded where it can actually start to deal with dense rocks. And with the faster, it's just more accurate, but can deal with faster transmission times for seismic data. And that can also be really informative as to informing us what's between drill holes, realistically and accurate. Oops. Oh, no. Sorry, jumping on. Okay. There's some really smart statistical techniques, again, being applied to reservoir analysis, where you can actually look at the detailed characteristics of samples and develop domains that are based on similarity in those characteristics. And it's not just absolute values of those characteristics, it's a relationship by which those characteristics vary in relation to one another. And that does a terrific job of identifying different domains. The drill hole data there is for a porphyry copper deposit. It's actually the Parker Challenge data that was used in the recent AusIMM conference. And this orange domain here and that purple domain there are just logged as augite-bearing basalts. And they're the host rocks of the main body of the copper mineralisation forming the deposit. But dimension reduction tells you that these rocks here are vastly different to these rocks here. And they shouldn't, even though they're all mineralised, they should be treated as two discrete domains. And so we're getting, techniques like this give us a much more objective view of where potentially we can consider putting domain boundaries. We might decide that it's not worth it, but that's our decision to make. And the information's there to refine that decision if we need to, or even use that data as one of the as a risk control and quantification measure. Run one scenario where we just treat it all as one entity. Run another scenario where we treat it as two different parts of the deposit. Data stewardship's really important. Data validation. It's good to have it. It's good to have all of the geological data in a proper database, not just a spreadsheet, because you can start to think about. There are quite simple automated checks that you can run on a database that you can't necessarily, or they're cumbersome and potentially prone to operator error if you start to do those sorts of checks on a spreadsheet. And they do some checking work, but it's not validation. The only way you validate a geological database is by using it, because then you don't just see the data inconsistencies, you see actual problems in the spatial distribution of data. So you might see a series of RC drill holes all of a sudden intersect other drill holes in subsequently drilled. And you know they didn't do that in the field. And they weren't planning to do that in the field. It shows you surveys of those holes were wrong. You might see holes that corkscrew to an extent that drill rods physically wouldn't accommodate without breaking. So you start to see all sorts of structural things and spatial things coming out in the data. So it lets you make decisions about whether that data is reliable and what we're going to do to correct that data, or if we're going to discount that data. But then if we start making decisions like that, we've got to have an audit trail that documents those decisions. Because when somebody comes to review the project and you've discounted data for any reason, then a competent banker or financier or auditor is going to ask why. And you've got to be able to answer that question. Okay. I've banged on about this. Geological models must conform with observed geology. It doesn't matter how geostatistically elegant your model might be, if it doesn't conform with what you've observed in drilling and mapping, then it's wrong. We've got to think about alternative interpretations, and that takes time. But the time and effort that goes into that work is an investment, because you're gaining a better understanding of the deposit as a result, and you're able to pass that understanding on to the other members of the project team. So that investment has measurable returns. So justifying the need for that investment shouldn't be based on intangibles. You can actually put that to project managers in fairly coherent and understandable ways. And there's actually techniques again now that are starting to emerge that in the implicit modelling and in machine learning based space that can really expose alternative interpretations almost automatically if we understand what those algorithms are doing. It's really interesting at the moment that the software companies are all working on implicit modelling, they're all working on geological modelling using neural networks. And they're all marketing it as a way of developing geological models faster. And they're actually underselling the value of those techniques. Or they're teaching their marketing pitch at management who are cost conscious and not technical people who should recognise the value of what they can tell you about uncertainty and deposit. Because all of those algorithms are based on a Gaussian function. And every Gaussian function tells you something about uncertainty. So the information that we actually need to be able to really get a good understanding of, potential uncertainty in the geological models probably already been generated, but it's not being reported. It's not being passed through to the person that's using that software. And as geoscientists, we've got to push back at that and tell the software companies that what you're doing is not good enough. There's a whole realm of information that you're generating that you're not telling us what the results of that work are. All of them, whether they're using radial basis functions like, that's the radial basis function is the basis of the implicit modeling in Leapfrog and Micromine. The newer software is starting to use support vector machines and various forms of neural networks, which are really distinguished by the way in which they honour downhole data. They all have this stochastic pattern, which we really need to tap into. They all rely on data being normally distributed. to work effectively, which is never the case, or rarely the case. But data can be normalised and can be back transferred. So we can do the modelling work in normalised space where these algorithms are really working at their peak and delivering reliable information. And what we're getting out of that is really we can stop talking about resources in terms of X grade and X tons. We can say that this resource has a most likely case of this tons and this grade, but within confidence limits that the company is comfortable with, it could represent this and it could represent that. And you can say what those confidence limits are. And that then provides a quantifiable metric on which resource classification can be based. And it's a metric that you can convey to anybody in clear English. You can say that, measured is plus or minus 15% variance. We're 50% confident that grade in tons could vary by 15% around this central value, rather than just saying, oh, it's measured because this drill hole is within 150 metres of 3 other drill holes, and they inform 3 different options around the drill hole around the block of the facility. But we can't treat the machine learning techniques as a black box. Competent persons, if they're going to use them, are going to have to understand how the different machine learning techniques. And again, really the message is it's not just about the speed of producing plausible models. They're great at producing plausible models, really good. But they're even better at telling us what the potential alternatives around that model could be. And they're not telling us that. So that, that examination of uncertainty does create data management and analysis overheads, and they can be considerable. Because if you're running 100 different scenarios, you've not just got one block model with 1 million cells in it, you've got a block model with 1 million cells in it, but for each variable is 100 million. So this is where cloud computing comes in. Really, there's 2 advantages from cloud computing. One is you can tap, potentially, you pay for it, but you can tap enormous data processing and data storage resources. And the storage is cheap, the processing and visualization costs you. The costs of that are coming down all the time. It means that you don't have to have a supercomputer sitting on your desk. You could be running this stuff on a phone in the cloud and getting the same results that you get from having a computer in your office, except for the upload and download time, which you're not going to be able to. But one trial I've run recently on a coal deposit on the west coast of New Zealand, run a simulated model for that on my desktop at home. Took 3.5 days, and I ran it in the cloud in about 14 minutes. It didn't take 3.5 days to upload and download the data. So if you see something that's wrong with the model that you've run, you can correct it. You can the other advantage of the cloud is that it actually becomes, you can actually use it as a platform for collaboration. So you can be sitting, working remotely from your office in Brisbane, and a colleague in Perth, or Singapore, or Hong Kong, or London can be looking at that same data and seeing the same results in real time and talking to you about it. You can identify a problem in the data that you want to thrash around with somebody in your company who has more experience. And they can just dial in and look at it. You're all seeing the same thing. And that really helps with the collaboration process. It really helps with bringing expertise to the project. And you can capture the decisions that you've made along the way and develop this elusive audit trail as well. So, in conclusion, really what we're facing at the moment is that there's a real opportunity to move to a more, firstly, a more consistent base for resource classification that's directly linked to uncertainty. Something that we can quantify and communicate to other professionals in different disciplines who all have a stake in the projects. We're guiding through their initial stages of development. We can actually start to see how risk isn't uniform across a deposit. It's going to vary spatially because the pattern of drilling that we have across a deposit might be uniform, but the underlying geology of the deposit is not going to be uniform behind that. We have different continuity in different parts of the deposit. And that then provides an opening to stop thinking about having to drill these things out on a grid. Drill deposits out based on the uncertainty that we can observe and understand in the mineralisation. Answer questions about uncertainty first. And finally, geoscientists really have a key role we need to step up to of being resource risk managers. So not only taking responsibility for minimising risks in data collection, enhancing the quality and the relevance of the information that's being collected, focus on the data that's relevant to the project, make sure that relevant data is the best that we can have. Thank you. Variance Labs, for those, probably nobody's heard of it, is a startup company at the moment. It's Australian based, and we're developing a cloud solution for validating data, understanding data at the early stage, working out how to domain data better, making sure that you use your existing tools to do geological modelling and resource estimation, but then providing more information about those models and most of the packages give you, and then taking the next step and moving into the uncertainty quantification area. And that's proceeding with a lot of sweat at the moment, but we'll probably be rolling it out to our initial alpha test users in the third quarter of this year. Apart from that, thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, it's ubiquitous very release who have been working in this space for a long time, and I'm sure some of them. Oh, okay. Well, that was a tone that Thanks, Andrew. I can talk about this for weeks and weeks, as you know. I'm just going to make one observation, and something that's really bothering me. In my opinion, geologists, many resource geologists, are incredibly poor at understanding why they're doing it and what it's going to be used for.
Yeah.
And I'll take you through the example of the project vision and stakeholders who are wanting to look at scoping level studies versus critical studies versus feed studies. In my experience, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room have seen resource estimates and made a resource estimate that's been the geostatistics that the data doesn't even really support the ability to use. And I'm going to refute Renee's dismissal of inverse distance, and I think the inverse distance is being given really poor credence here. For many, many resource estimates at an inferred level, inverse distance is absolutely appropriate. Not for every deposit, but given the level of data that you have for an inferred resource estimate, inverse distance resource estimations are potentially very appropriate and potentially the most cost-effective way to deliver an inferred resource. Yet many geologists will just shy away from using inverse distance to resource estimates because they've got access to sophisticated geostatistical techniques which may or may not add any value at all to the level of work that they're doing.
Yeah.
So that's my gripe for the day.
Yeah.
But thanks for the
I think
talk.
you're probably right. Like, I wouldn't argue with that. But at the inferred level only, because you do to make sure a project progresses, you've got to be able to communicate what the potential of that project might be. And at the inferred level, what are we dealing with? Plus or minus 50%? Then, I think it really doesn't matter if you're using inferred distance interpolation or polygons or nearest neighbor. There's a suite of tools that can be used, but you can't then take those tools further to start to do detailed planning. And they're not really going to tell you a lot about where there might be uncertainty in the project. And that's because the early drilling often on which those resource estimates are based is all out in the uncorrelated space. And we haven't got enough information at an early stage in the projects to really inform what might be happening in the early part of the variogram. And if you've got that, then I'd argue that you can actually start to apply some of the simple kriging techniques and get an equally good estimate of what might be present. Yeah. But yeah, I don't agree with just ruling it out entirely. Definitely not.
Any other questions? Here's one.
Thank you. Andy, Tony Shellshare. What's been your level of success in communicating to management that they really need to drill some close-spaced holes once they get to that discovery stage and they've outlined a deposit that looks promising?
I've been lucky and actually been fairly successful in that, but it's a tough road.
Yeah,
it's horrible. You have to present a really strong case to get that support, because the first focus, particularly in mid-tier and smaller companies, is to produce an attractive announcement that's beneficial to investor perception of the company and attracts investment through an increase in the share price.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to, there's a need for that. But you go beyond that need fairly quickly to having to have that closer spaced information.
I guess it comes back to trying to educate them on the fact that some close-spaced holes will give them a much better feel for the close-spaced variability and, importantly, your nugget effect, than going in and saying, oh, we'll drill it all over 100 metres and we'll start infilling at 50 metres.
Yeah.
And if you get a good sense of your variability, you may discover that 100 metres is fine for the deposit in certain domains.
That's right. You can actually argue, the argument I've used very often has been, if we do this close-spaced work, we might be able to reduce the amount of drilling we have to do to bring this deposit up to this level of confidence by a fairly significant amount.
That's right.
And that gains traction, but it only gains traction with people who are thinking in the longer term.
Yes, yeah, and sometimes that just doesn't exist.
Yeah,
thank you.
And that long-term thinking is not universal across the industry, and certainly not across boards, as it should be.
Do you think that the geologists are getting enough training in statistics at the moment to understand what their problems they're facing are and how to evaluate the models? Because most of these models are just black boxes. You put data in and nobody has a clue what's happening inside.
The answer to that's definitely not. I think it's an absolute disgrace in Australia at the moment that there's not one university that's offering any formal instruction in geostatistics or statistics. University of Adelaide is heading in that direction of introducing a new course at the moment, but it's coming from the environmental school at Adelaide, which are more interested in 2D geostatistics and 3D geostatistics. So I suspect that they're on a learning curve as well, but at least it's happening. There was a good course at Curtin, but that ceased, I don't know how many years ago now. And it's a real indictment. The only way you get any exposure to geostatistics at the moment in this country is by on-the-job learning and being on a project where you're working with people who really understand what the applications and potential benefits of the techniques are. And that's a real indictment on both the education sector and on industry for not recognising the need for that.
We have some very good geostatistical courses come to Australia. Sorry. We do have some very good geostatistical courses that come to Australia.
Yes.
And run by Australians.
Yes.
On a regular basis. I did
Yeah.
many years with Place of Dome with George Verley and Clayton Deutsch and
Yep.
Harry Parker.
Yep.
And others. And they're excellent courses. It's just a
But
shame they don't get a bit more airplay.
They're not frequent enough, and they don't get enough people.
Agree.
Not enough opportunity for people to go through them,
Mm.
and not enough support from companies to put staff through them. It's I think there's a really dangerous trend amongst some of the bigger companies at the moment that they have these internal expert programs. And so all of a sudden they've moved from sending people to conferences and sending people on courses where they get ideas and understand problems that other companies are facing. And they're learning from people within their own organization who have probably spent much of their career in that organization and haven't had that exposure either. So it creates a sort of a self-perpetuating environment where the standard of knowledge just really isn't increasing. I did a course a few years ago, it was an Edgermine course, and there was only 12 people on the course. I forget what it was even in now. There was 12 people on the course, and they were all from different companies, and they were in the US and Canada and Australia and France. It was something to do with uranium exploration. And the course content itself was pretty good, but the real value of the course came from the question and answer sessions and the interaction with the other attendees, which the person that facilitated this course was really good at. And that's where the benefit of looking outside your organization comes from. You're seeing what other people are facing and getting exposure to that. And if you know anything about the subject, it forces you to think about what you're doing. And that's the opportunity that we're missing at the moment, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Andrew, everyone's understanding of risk and acceptance or comfort with risk is different.
Yep.
Is there any way to unify? Because obviously we're reporting through ASX or to management or whoever, but we're all assessing it differently.
Yeah.
So what I see as a risk, someone else may not, and they'll discount it.
Yep. That's where transparency is important. So you've got to describe what you see as the risks in the project are, and what the materiality of those risks to what the potential materiality of the project, and what that's posed by each of those risks. And it's up to the company's senior management and board to communicate what the company's risk appetite is. So that with knowledge of that, you can start to report back to the management and board in those sorts of terms. But if you don't have a more informed understanding of what the extent of risk is in particular areas, that type of reporting is really difficult.
And with towards the end there, you presented the idea of the, I guess, rapid multiple models to cover all scenarios or potential scenarios. Is there a risk then, to use the term, of us coming back to our consensus model and saying, well, we've dealt with it all because this is what all the models are suggesting, or the majority of models, which basically just hides a lot of the risk because it's the consensus. Yeah,
well, that's the problem with simulation, is that there's one of the basic outputs from simulation is a mean estimate of what the value in each cell is. And if you've done the simulations right, it's probably going to be close to the Krieg estimate. And you're not really showing anything that you could have shown by just Krieging the data in the first place. So you've got to look at the entropy that's revealed by different realizations and the spread of variables in each cell to better understand what that risk is and where it's coming from. So yeah, unless you do that, take that extra step, and that step involves a lot of processing and understanding of multiple, equally probable, but individually different realizations before you really start to get value from the process.
One more question?
Just want to follow up on that discussion about risk. Just a couple of comments. I've been involved in a number of projects looking at mining project risk registers. And I can say that a number of projects I've been involved with do not mention resource-related estimation risk once on their mining risk register. And I've also been involved in risk committees where geologists are not even invited to participate because they're perceived not to generate any value in assessing a risk of a mining venture, which shows you how poorly geologists are considered in those companies.
Yeah, and we're not reminding them that there's all these surveys out there that say that resource risk is the single greatest contributor to project underperformance. There's a real communication gap that we've got, as individuals, we've got a responsibility to try and bridge.
We don't have any questions from home. Does anyone else have any last? Oh, another one.
I work in oil and gas. I'm with Santos, and I did work in mining before, and I can't believe that the stochastic probabilistic determination of resources in the mining industry isn't more prevalent.
Yeah,
because to me it's just natural the way we think about things.
Yeah. I agree with you. Several of the collaborators I've got in the company are oil and gas geoscientists for that reason. But it's a process. My role really is to bridge their gap in understanding between the oil and gas industry and minerals and how that information transfer can occur.
All right. Oh, another one.
One comment coming to what Mark said before, which I agree with wholeheartedly, and I still use ID squared or ID cubed as appropriate in very early stages.
Yep.
But one thing a lot of people don't realise is one of the big components of geostatistics and then moving forward into conditional simulation, it's a step into a tool that can quantify your estimation variance.
Yep.
It can actually calculate a level of uncertainty. And 30 years ago with Placer Dome, we were building block models of grades and block models of the estimation variance to give us our categorisation.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why people are so slow to catch up with it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Just
I think that's the sort of time I was talking about, you're referring to during the talk, and Placer were one of the leaders at that time, but they were on their own.
All right, on that note, thank you to Andrew.
Thanks, everybody.